Hi, we're here today to discuss the new mCLASS with DIBELS 8th edition, and we're going to walk through the key upgrades. I'm Alan Stadmauer, the Executive Director of Literacy at Amplify, and I'm here with Dr. Gina Biancarosa, the Assistant Professor and Ann Swindle's Chair in Education at the University of Oregon, who will get to talk to us today about DIBELS 8th edition and the big upgrades and benefits within it. So our agenda today is going to be, first we'll talk about DIBELS 8th, that will be Gina, and then afterwards I'll chime back in and show you the current version of mCLASS with DIBELS 8th edition. So Gina, take it away.
Great, thank you so much, Alan. So I am Gina Biancarosa, as Alan mentioned, and I'm a professor at the University of Oregon, and it's my great pleasure to be talking to you today about DIBELS 8th edition. My agenda within our agenda is that I'll go over briefly the guiding principles that we had in developing and validating DIBELS 8th edition. Then I will share with you the details of what's new for each of our subtests. And finally, I'll do a brief review of the technical adequacy evidence that we have to date. So what is DIBELS 8th edition? DIBELS 8th edition is the most comprehensive literacy assessment system that we have had for DIBELS since its inauguration. And it expands on and refines features from all of the previous DIBELS editions. Our changes for DIBELS 8th edition were rooted in trends and changes in educational priorities, standards, and expectations. Long-standing critiques of CBMs like DIBELS, for example, the differences in difficulty between forms and something like oral reading fluency, as well as advances in measurement science and sort of how we think about creating the validity argument for a measure. And over the last decade, since the last version of DIBELS was introduced, the field has seen sort of increasing rigor of the standards that we hold our screening and progress monitoring measures to. And so, of course, we want to keep DIBELS abreast of those standards. And finally, most recently, we've seen expanded use of CBMs across many states in the US as dyslexia screeners. And we wanted to make sure that our validity evidence also attended to this. So we have expanded the availability of DIBELS 8th edition. It now runs from kindergarten through 8th grade. And you can see here each of the subtests that we have. Letter naming fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, nonsense word reading fluency, sight word reading fluency, oral reading fluency, and maze. And for these, you can see that some of these have been with us for a long time in the DIBELS system, but we've simply expanded their availability to sometimes earlier time points, as well as to later time points, and that the sight word reading fluency measure itself is entirely new. And we'll talk about why we added that measure when we get into each of the subtests in more detail. We also paid a lot of attention to minimizing assessment time. And this is because in response to customer demand, we now have subtests available throughout an academic year, which could have the effect of increasing assessment time. So a number of our innovations were designed to sort of offset that potential increase in assessment time. One of the best advances is that based on a great deal of research at this point, it's been established that for oral reading fluency, you really don't need to give 3 passages. That 1 passage is as predictive as 3. And so that cuts down on assessment time, obviously 2 minutes per child in any grade in which oral reading fluency is administered. We've also introduced new rules to discontinue benchmarking in the earliest grades and to gate students out of additional assessment in the later grades. And these are ways that we can sort of save ourselves from administering assessments where the outcome is pretty predictable based on how a student has performed so far. Finally, as always with mCLASS, tablet administration also results in additional time savings for both individual and group administrators. So now I'll talk about each of the subtests, and I'll begin with letter naming fluency. Some of the innovations here are that we looked into the research on dyslexia-friendly fonts and font sizes. And what we found is that, generally speaking, well, actually across the board, that the research supporting dyslexia-friendly fonts tend to be performed by people who are actually trying to sell you those fonts. Whereas when third parties have investigated those fonts compared to all the fonts that we're much more used to seeing from day to day, like Times New Roman or Arial or what have you, that there's really no difference in the effects on students with dyslexia in their ability to demonstrate their reading skills. So we ended up just paying attention to the font size research and research that sort of indicates that fonts that have more pronounced serifs, which are the sort of little tails that you see on letters, help students to distinguish letters. And we use the Rockwell font in everything but our continuous text subtests now because of its improved visibility. In addition to a lot of attention to fonts and font sizes, we also, in response to the use of letter naming fluency as a rapid naming measure in many states, we decided to exclude 3 letters from letter naming fluency: uppercase and lowercase w and the lowercase l. And that's simply because W is the only letter in the English language that it takes 3 phonemes to name. All the others are single phoneme names. So any place that W occurs on a form is going to slow individuals down, and differences in where that letter would appear would create undesirable form effects. So W is still an important letter. Children need to know it, but we trust that you have other ways of assessing whether children know the letter W. What we're really trying to get at here is the fluency with which children know their letter names and sort of their underlying ability to rapidly name things. Lowercase l was also dropped simply because there is no font that we could find where the lowercase l does not also look like the number 1. And we found over the years that this is confusing not only for children, but also for those who are administering DIBELS forms. And so again, because it's creating disfluency for our students, but also in this case, disfluency for our raters, we dropped that letter. The last 2 things that I'll note is that in kindergarten, we restricted the letters to simply the 40 most frequently used letters in print. And that was just to prevent students from having to identify very, very rarely seen letters in print. So for example, a capital X or a capital Z. These are simply not seen very frequently in print. And so the chances that our kindergartners are going to know them, particularly at the beginning of the year, are pretty slim. The final innovation was that we pay attention to the frequency of letters in how we assign them to the forms. And so in the sample form before you, you can see that the first letter on this form is the lowercase o. And O happens to be one of the 5 most frequently seen in print letters. And so every form of L and F begins with one of the 5 most frequently seen in print letters. And then as the forms go on, the frequency with which letters are seen is less and less. And the reason we did this was both to better control for equivalency of forms, but also to really kind of stack the deck in favor of our most vulnerable learners so that they're able to demonstrate what they know on the items that they are most likely to know. We'll move on now to phoneme segmentation fluency. We did a bit less here in terms of innovations. The main things that we did were to consider the frequency with which words appear in written English, as well as the number of phonemes in a word. so that we go from words with the fewest phonemes to words with the most phonemes on each form, proceeding from 2 phonemes to then 3 and 4 and so on. And the words are drawn from a certain pool of the most frequent words in written English, so that we're not asking students to segment words that they may never have heard before in their daily lives. And the last thing that we did was, previously phoneme segmentation fluency was equivalent difficulty in both kindergarten and first grade. And we now actually have somewhat more difficult forms in first grade. So we get beyond 4 and even 5 phoneme words towards the end of a form. And that's so that our most able readers are able to demonstrate more phonemic awareness should they have it. For nonsense word fluency, we did quite a bit here. First of all, we extended its availability to grades 2 and 3. And this is based on research that suggests that having nonsense word fluency forms, particularly those that are correspond with the type of spelling patterns that students encounter in these grades, is informative in terms of flagging students who may need additional intervention. In addition, we also restricted ourselves to only using what we call legal spelling patterns in English. So in older versions of DIBELS, you might remember that you would see a word, a nonsense word like FEV, F-E-V. And obviously, there are no words in the English language that end in V. And so there were a number of words like that. And the words that appeared on the forms really didn't pay much attention to not only legal spelling, but the degree of frequency that those spelling patterns, when they are legal, appear in the English language. So here we have kind of an excerpt from sort of the middle of a nonsense word fluency form. So this is not the beginning of a form. And so what you can see is that we have in the highlighted yellow box how the forms, as we go further down, increase in difficulty. And so you can see that we have increasing numbers of phonemes, as well as increasing difficulty in the spelling patterns. And so we chose the middle of a form so that we could really demonstrate how this happens across items within a grade. Importantly, however, we have not made these forms so difficult that our most vulnerable learners are going to experience even more frustration than they might have before with something like nonsense word fluency. So here we see the template for a first grade nonsense word fluency form. And you can see that the first 5 rows are either VC or CVC spelling pattern words. And then after that point is when we introduce R controlled vowels and silent E. And then after another 4 rows, we begin to introduce consonant blends. And this was done specifically so that our most vulnerable learners aren't being forced to encounter these more advanced spelling patterns when, in fact, maybe they're still struggling with the simplest spelling patterns. So this red bracket that I just added to the screen shows you where the cut score for risk is on this first grade form. And so the idea is that our most vulnerable learners are going to experience NWF in first grade the same way they always have, as a CVC and VC kind of test. But for our more able learners, we're going to be able to learn additional information about their degree of fluency with more advanced spelling patterns. And this becomes even more relevant as we progress through an academic year. So you can see here the different word types that we include now in nonsense word fluency. And as I mentioned, we go up through consonant blends in first grade. We do not introduce vowel blends or digraphs until second grade. And second grade, we also, towards the very end of the form, also introduce 2-syllable words. And that increases in frequency in the third grade forms, where we will also see some more advanced sort of syllable junctures where we're kind of seeing words that have open initial syllables like copalt or closed like bud milk. In addition to nonsense word fluency, we now offer word reading fluency. And the reason that we decided to do this is that there's been a number of studies in the last decade that have demonstrated that word reading fluency captures students at risk for not meeting end-of-year reading goals that are missed by both NWF and oral reading fluency. So what word reading fluency does is it assesses high-frequency words across multiple word lists. And these words are words that are typically known at the grade level assessed. As with nonsense word fluency, these forms increase in difficulty across grades. So we have the simplest words and the most frequent words in kindergarten to less and less frequent words as we go up the grades. And then also within a form, across items, we start with the easiest items and progress to the more difficult items. And this is based similarly to what we did with nonsense word fluency on research that demonstrates that having the easier items first allows our most vulnerable learners to demonstrate what they know. So a big question that we often receive is why we would assess both nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. And the reason for this is because there are dual routes to reading fluency. Nonsense word fluency gets at the decoding route, which historically has been where a lot of readers will struggle the most. But word reading fluency gets at the other route, which is sight word recognition, which is based on the idea that in English, we have words that simply aren't decodable. So the simplest examples are things like the word the or of or was. These don't follow the rules, and students need to be able to recognize these on sight in order to really keep going and make meaning from text as they read. So what you can see here in the green, and I'm highlighting in the second grade graph, we have in the upper left, kindergarten, upper right is first grade, and the lower left is second, and the lower right is third. And along the x-axis, we have nonsense word fluency, correct letter sounds. And these are using our new, more advanced nonsense word fluency. And so you can see that we have a number of these kids in the green who look okay on nonsense word fluency. They're actually just past the cut point for benchmark on nonsense word fluency. And that's what that vertical line is indicating. However, they are below the benchmark for word reading fluency, which is indicated by that horizontal line. So these green children, or the children who are represented in green, are students we would have missed if we only administered nonsense word fluency. These are students who cannot name some of the most frequent words in the English language at an appropriate rate that would deem us at an appropriate rate that would lead us to deem them at low risk. You can also see that we can oftentimes have a really kind of outlier case. Here we've got a child who is really just doing fantastic at nonsense word fluency, but still, as with the other dots in green, is below what we would hope for sight word recognition fluency. Now, we also don't want to abandon nonsense word fluency because otherwise we would be missing all of the students who are in the turquoise. And these are the students who are above benchmark on word reading fluency, but below benchmark on nonsense word fluency. And these are students who may not be able to decode very well and are in fact perhaps relying on their sight word knowledge as a crutch, which will serve them less and less well as they get beyond second and third grade. And so this is really in a nutshell why we administer both nonsense word fluency and word reading fluency. So oral reading fluency, as I mentioned earlier, we now only administer one passage at each benchmark period, which makes administration quicker and easier for educators. Beyond that, we actually convened a panel of published authors and aspiring authors who were current or former classroom teachers to write all of our passages. And then all of the passages were reviewed by a panel of parents and former classroom teachers for grade appropriateness and engagingness, as well as for text complexity. And importantly, we assigned passages to different grade levels, not only based on readability, which is what used to rule the day in previous versions of DIBELS, but also based on judgments of text complexity. So texts that might have been very readable, but were conceptually too complex for their readability, at least in terms of the grade level, the targeted grade level, were not used in that grade level. And ones that were deemed too conceptually sort of facile or easy were also potentially not used, even though readability might have been higher. And this allows us to really be responsive to advancing notions of really what makes a text more or less readable beyond simply decodability. Finally, we come to MAISE. And MAISE, like oral reading fluency, was written by the same pool of writers and reviewed by the same pool of parents and teachers. And in addition to that, we used research to reformat our MAISE passages. So font sizes are now bigger in the lower grades, and the line length is now shorter. And this represents what is deemed more sort of grade appropriate, based on previous research by others that has shown that having a line that is too long or a font size that is too small can actually interfere with comprehension, which of course is exactly what we're trying to measure in MAISE. And then the last thing we did was pay a bit more attention to how we select our distractors for the missing words. So you can see, for example, they use the field behind ands. Here the answer is house. And what we did was the distractors are all the same part of speech. So whenever that was possible, which was generally when we had a noun, verb, adjective, or adverb, we would do so. And in other cases, we would try to keep at least one of the distractors the same part of speech. There were a number of other things that guided us, but those are really kind of the big ideas. So I mentioned the font and font sizes. This goes across all subtests and that DIBELS offers. We are also working on equating oral reading fluency in MAISE forms, because despite all our best efforts to control equivalence of forms, historically it's been shown that oral reading fluency in MAISE passages still have differences in difficulty on average. And so this equating work will address that. We also have zones of growth, which will enable folks to look at student growth relative to average and below and above average growth for a particular starting point for each student's starting point, and can also be used in goal setting and progress monitoring. And then finally, we now have composite scores that are rooted in both theory and empirical data. So our takeaways here are that we have more deliberate item sampling and placement, which results in more strictly comparable or equivalent forms than ever before. The progressive difficulty approach that we've used in creating forms also enables us to kind of get the best data that we can from all learners without sacrificing screening validity. And the constellation of subtests across kindergarten through 8th grade in league with our new discontinue rules ensure the securest safety net yet that DIBELS has offered. So now I'll briefly review our technical adequacy evidence. And in a nutshell, you'll find that we have more evidence and that it's stronger than ever before for any previous DIBELS edition. So far, we have completed 2 validation studies where we followed students from fall through the end of the academic year. And we have a 3rd currently underway in the 2019-2020 academic year. The previous studies have engaged over 10,000 children in kindergarten through 8th grade from almost 50 schools now in, I believe, when you look at the non-overlapping states, in almost half of the states. We represent in both of the samples all census regions and locales, meaning urban, rural, what have you. Both samples are racially and ethnically diverse, which is a vast improvement over previous validity samples for DIBELS, and also represent the average rate of free and reduced meals across the country. And we used a number of different criterion measures, as you can see here. Importantly, as we talk about the evidence, we use the DIBELS Next Composite Score for validating our kindergarten measures and the Iowa assessment of reading for grades 1 through 8. So our general technical adequacy evidence is more bountiful and as good as or stronger than any previous DIBELS version, as I mentioned. Our alternate form reliability is uniformly high, ranging from a low of 0.82, which is already quite high, to a high of 0.95. The only exception here is maize, where reliability for alternate forms is a little bit lower, and that's pretty traditionally found with maize. Nonetheless, that's still considered adequate reliability. Now, when it comes to test-retest reliability, the ranges again go from 0.7 to about 0.9, and this is despite the fact that we allowed 2 to 3 months to elapse between test and retest. And so what this tells us is that we have a great deal of reliability in the new DIBELS measures. When it comes to concurrent and predictive validity evidence, our correlations are strong for all of the individual subtests and for the composite scores, generally above 0.5. But for the composite scores, they're actually very strong, generally above 0.7, which is really incredible, actually. When it comes to our screening accuracy evidence, this is the accuracy with which we identify students who are in need of intensive support. Our cut scores are generally strong across subtests and grades. So AUCs represent the area under a curve, and you generally want to see these at 0.7 or above, and that is what we see. When it comes to our composite cut scores, that number goes up to 0.8, which is really considered sort of a gold standard. Sensitivity is the degree to which we are capturing students who are at risk with our cut scores. And again, these statistics are as good as or better than what is traditionally looked for. And specificity is the degree to which these cut scores are accurately saying that students are not at risk when in fact they are not at risk. And so, as you can see, for the subtests, these are good, and for the composites, they're even better. And especially in the lower grades, honestly, these numbers get even higher. I'll just briefly touch on that we are also collecting validity evidence around the use of DIBELS as screeners for specific reading subskills. Traditionally, DIBELS has been validated as a measure of predicting general reading risk, and it still does that. All of our evidence that we've spoken about to date, or up until this point, addresses that. But we also now have evidence that LNF is indeed a measure of rapid naming, that phonemic segmentation is indeed a measure of phonological awareness, and that our measures of nonsense word reading fluency and word reading fluency are also measuring the academic principle and basically correlate with other measures of those specific abilities or skills. Of course, most importantly, all of these measures predict word reading ability very, very strongly. And this is the one characteristic of students with dyslexia that all dyslexia definitions agree on. So we do have ongoing technical adequacy research. And the main thing I'd like to highlight is that in our approach to DIBELS 8th edition, we're taking a modern approach to measurement validity. And that means that for us, validity is an ongoing argument that requires repeated and frequent investigation to make sure that we're staying on top of how reading is conceptualized and operationalized in the field. And so that means that we are continuing to work on equating our forms, gathering more data around dyslexia screening, trying to actually improve our ability to project well into the future, and also trying to validate our progress monitoring tools with the sort of most cutting edge approaches. So if I can leave you with a 30,000-foot view of DIBELS 8th edition, I hope that you've come away with the impression that we have improved coverage over every previous DIBELS edition. We've improved the content of each of our subtests. We've also improved alignment with our user needs, both in response to legislated demands, but also demands to keep assessment time to a minimum. And finally, we've improved our technical adequacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. That was really excellent. I would love to take a few minutes to talk about how exactly this wonderful, rich DIBELS information ends up coming across in mCLASS. So we completely revamped mCLASS from beginning to end this past summer. We released the brand new version, and among the big ideas that it has is firstly to reduce the number of finger taps and mouse clicks that you need throughout the platform to make it simpler, to really increase the level of reporting to make them easier to understand for teachers, especially those who might be new to the DIBELS universe, and to keep them focused on skills. And last but not least, we'll see that we take advantage of the really rich skills progressions that Gina described in order to be able to provide deeper level of analysis of a student's skills and actually group students and provide instruction. So let's start by taking a look at how things are administered in the new mCLASS. We're taking a look at the perspective of Mrs. Benson's administration screen. So the first thing that she has in front of her is her whole class list, and we're at the benchmark period. So we'll take a look at Lee Aaron. So I'd like to administer his NWF, his beginning of year first grade. And the first thing that we notice is that some of the assessments have dark blue and one of them is light blue. That's the gating process that Gina mentioned earlier. At the beginning of first grade or in kindergarten, we want to administer the basic skills to a student, and only if they're doing okay are they going to get a harder skill like ORF. On the other hand, if a student at middle of year will start with the harder skills and only move down to the quote unquote precursor skills if a student is not blue. If they're running well above benchmark on ORF, then for example, we may not need to do their letter naming. So let's take a look at Lee's nonsense word fluency. The first thing, we have simplified the reminders. We still have reminders that are crucial for the new teachers. Mr. Say is still there in order to help us tell the students exactly the instructions. We move through the practice item, and then once Lee is correct, Mrs. Benson will be able to start the assessment. As we can see, the 1-minute timer goes up on the top of the screen. We'll see it'll turn yellow 5 seconds before the end, our 3 hesitation timer, and the current word that Lee is working on. So he says tib, the whole word, he recodes it, the whole word, sorry, he skipped rep, hab, does, gets the wrong, b, goes on to the next one, and here he starts by sounding out, and then he blends. Now in DIBELS 8th, he'll actually get a point for recoding that word correctly. So here we go, we're continuing. We have an error, a self-correct, and then a recode of the whole word. Again, we have the sounding out, a whole word correct, and here we are at SEP. The screen is turning yellow to let us know we're on the last item. And then when we stop and we accept the score, we could invalidate it, of course. And here we are back at the screen where we can see that Lee scored well below benchmark for his letter sounds and below benchmark for his decoding for his first year, for his first grade BOY. Now, had this been progress monitoring, we would have just indicated that on the top. If we would have finished all of Lee's benchmark, we would have progress monitoring recommendations, but then of course we can always select any measure. With the new skills progression in DIBELS 8th, there are 20 alternate forms per measure per year for the vast majority of the measures. So we have a lot more progress monitoring available. Now let's imagine that Mrs. Benson has finished off her whole first grade class and she comes to mCLASS home. The first thing she'll see is a summary view of the benchmark that was just done, the beginning of the year, and she can see that all 15 of her 15 students have completed their benchmark. Every teacher wants that at-a-glance perspective. So here she could see that about half of her class's students are performing below or well below benchmark, and we could see pretty quickly that the big hot spot is in decoding, just like what we saw with Lee, where his NWF words recoded correctly. Here we have 11 out of the 15 students are below the beginning of first grade benchmark. As we scroll down, we have all the foundational early literacy skills and all of the results. Here, as you could see, we've organized it by skill, so that way teachers can get very quickly to their instruction. And Mrs. Benson might want to know which of the students who are struggling with decoding. So she sorts. Here are all the 11 students who are below and well below. And as we could see pretty quickly, about half of those students are still struggling with their letter names and the phonemic awareness. But there's also a group that are doing just fine on their letter names, their phonemic awareness, and their letter sounds, but need work on their decoding. If we come back to the list, we could take a look at Emma Ashley and see very quickly that she's below benchmark in her phonemic segmentation. She has 33 segments correct out of the 39 that she needed. And as we scroll down, we see the full transcript. Here we see she segmented the 2 phoneme words for here on the indicated broken lines. But by the time that she gets to the 3 phoneme words and 4 phoneme words, food, she was blending. By the time that she got to bit, she struggled a little bit more, and then she just didn't get very far. All of her historical data is available, as well as her progress monitoring graphs. But what becomes very interesting is if we click on the instruction tab. So mCLASS has gone ahead and analyzed those probe details for all of her scores across all of her different measures and has analyzed them, identified the patterns that she has across all of her probes, each probe one at a time, so she's making mistakes on specific letters in her L and F. She's segmenting the words with 2, but not more on her phonemes. And the recommendation is that she can segment some words, but needs to be working fluency in phonemic segmentation for more words. And down all the way below, we see activities that we could do with Emma. mCLASS has taken the whole class, done the analysis of their reading patterns and their scores, and then gone ahead and recommended groups. So here's a group for early phonological awareness. Here's Emma's group on phonemic awareness. There's one for decoding, as we saw that we had a group that really need to work a little bit with their NWF and their decoding. And here's the high flyers who are working on their comprehension skills. If we look a little deeper into Emma's group, we could see that we have careful discussion of what they can do, what they need to work on, the pedagogy involved, how that would impact ELLs, the reading patterns of the group, and activities that you can do with that group. So here we are, 10 to 20-minute activities that a teacher can lead with each of the different groups to work on their primary skills. For each of BOY, MOY, and EOY, mCLASS offers a Home Connect letter in both English and Spanish. So here's Emma's letter, and it explains in parent-friendly language how she did, And below it are activities that could be done at home to help Emma work on her phonemic awareness skills, as well as a website that parents can use, also available in English or in Spanish, that parents can use to find more activities that they could do with Emma. The progress monitoring reports will assist teachers every time they progress monitor. And the zones of growth that Dr. Biancarosa mentioned will enable teachers to look at a national sample of students who started at the same point. So here we see Emma had done well below on her letter naming fluency. In order to reach her benchmark goal of 60 by the middle of the year, she would need to make above average growth as compared to a national sample of other students who started at the exact same point on her letter naming fluency. When we look at her composite, we see that she really needs to make a lot of growth if she's going to get to the benchmark in one semester. But what that tells us that we could set achievable and realistic goals for Emma, and maybe we need to celebrate the growth that she makes in middle of the year and really target that she'll get to the benchmark by the end of the year. So this tool is going to help teachers set the right goals and then afterwards be able to analyze and see how their students have done relative to the goals that have been set. What does not change in the new mCLASS is you have the wonderful reporting and analytics suite that district leaders use to be able to identify, to filter, slice, and dice, identify how their first graders are doing across schools, analyze growth, comparing how things go across measures, and of course, downloading all of the data that's available in mCLASS. They get all of the same kinds of reports that they have always been able to do before. So once again, we've seen how to assess, we've seen the benchmark reports, the item level details, there's historical information, progress monitoring reports, zones of growth goal setting, instruction for students, for groups, 10 to 20-minute activities, and access to all of the activities, Home Connect letters in English and Spanish, and district level reports. So I hope you enjoyed that brief walkthrough of the new mCLASS. We're thrilled that you spent the time with us today, and I thank you so much for your time.